Two men, two baseballs. Ty Cobb's baseball was all calculation. Every step, every run, every hit, mind games. When Cobb walked onto the field, he studied the man across from him, found the weaknesses, used them, mercilessly. Babe Ruth's baseball had no calculation, only power, only instinct, only the swing. And in 1921, these two men met on the same field. Cobb said something, Ruth didn't respond. But in the next at-bat, in front of everyone, the response came. And it was the quietest and most devastating answer in baseball history. To understand what was said and why it mattered, you need to understand what Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth represented, not just as players, as ideas, as two completely different answers to the same question. What is baseball? What should baseball be? And who gets to decide? Ty Cobb was born December 18, 1886, in Narrows, Georgia. His father was a school principal, a state senator, a man who believed that intelligence and discipline were the only tools worth having. He raised Ty accordingly, with expectations that had no ceiling and no tolerance for anything below the ceiling. Cobb arrived at professional baseball in 1905 and immediately became the most hated man in the sport. Not because he was cruel, though he was often cruel. Not because he was violent, though he was often violent. Because he was so relentlessly, exhaustingly, completely committed to winning that anyone who stood between him and winning became something to be removed. He sharpened his spikes. He slid into bases with the intention of drawing blood. He screamed at pitchers and umpires and teammates and opponents with the focused hostility of a man who had converted all of his considerable intelligence into a single purpose: winning. By any means, at any cost, to anyone who got in the way. His numbers were historic. Career batting average of .366, the highest in the history of professional baseball. Still the highest. 4,189 hits, still the third most in history. He won 12 batting titles. Was the most feared hitter of the dead ball era. Was the standard by which all other hitters of his generation were measured. And he was also, for most of his career, the undisputed best player in baseball. The player who defined what the sport was, who played it at its highest level, who understood it most completely. Cobb's baseball was chess, was the intelligence of a man who had studied every angle and mastered every contingency and left nothing to chance. He ran the bases as if he had already calculated every possible outcome of every possible throw and positioned himself accordingly. He hit for average rather than power, because hitting for average was what the game rewarded, and Cobb gave himself completely to what the game rewarded. He was the game's perfect expression, or so he believed. Then Babe Ruth happened. Ruth was born in 1895, 9 years after Cobb, in Baltimore. Raised in St. Mary's Industrial School. Left-handed pitcher who became the most powerful right-handed hitter baseball had ever seen. When Ruth arrived in New York in 1920, something happened to the sport that Cobb had spent his entire career mastering. The sport changed. Changed around him. Changed because of Ruth. Ruth hit 54 home runs in 1920. The entire American League had hit 369. Ruth alone hit nearly 15% of all the home runs in the league. And the crowds came in numbers that the sport had never seen, came to see something specific. Came to see what Ruth did when he connected fully with a baseball. The trajectory, the sound, the specific quality of something going farther than seems possible. Cobb watched, and what Cobb felt was not admiration, was not appreciation, was not the respect of one great player for another great player doing something genuinely different. What Cobb felt was something closer to contempt, mixed with something he would never have admitted, something that looked, from the inside, like fear. Cobb said publicly what he felt privately. He gave interviews, wrote columns, made his position on Ruth clear in terms that left nothing to interpretation. Ruth was a carnival act, a freak of nature, a man who had reduced the most intelligent game in American sport to the level of a sideshow. Home runs were for men who couldn't hit, who couldn't run, who couldn't think. Real baseball was what Cobb played. Scientific baseball. The baseball of execution and intelligence and the 10,000 small decisions that separated players who understood the game from players who merely had strong arms and large bodies. Ruth's baseball was not baseball. It was spectacle. And spectacle was not what the sport needed. It was what the sport was being cheapened by. Cobb said these things loudly and repeatedly, and with the conviction of a man who believed them completely. Ruth said almost nothing publicly in response. This was not like Ruth. Ruth was not typically a man who absorbed criticism without answering it. He had opinions and stated them. Had no patience for false modesty or diplomatic silence when something direct was available. But Cobb specifically, he mostly left alone. Not because he was afraid of Cobb, not because he respected Cobb in a way that required restraint, because Ruth understood something about Cobb that Cobb didn't understand about himself. That Cobb was losing, that the baseball Cobb represented, the chess game, the spiked slides, the 12 batting titles, was being left behind by the sport that Ruth was remaking. That the argument was already settled. Ruth was not going to debate a man who was already on the wrong side of history. He was simply going to keep hitting home runs and let the crowds and the box scores make the argument for him. The 1921 meeting was not inevitable, the way historical meetings are sometimes described as inevitable. It happened because both men were in the American League and played against each other's teams multiple times per season. Cobb was with Detroit. Ruth was with New York. They had faced each other before, would face each other again. But 1921 was a specific year. Ruth was in the middle of his 59 home run season, the season that would stand as his personal record until 1927. Cobb was still excellent, but already past his absolute peak. The gap between what each man represented was widening rather than narrowing. And Cobb, who was not a man who accepted losing quietly, had been making his feelings about Ruth and Ruth's baseball known with increasing frequency and increasing specificity. The at-bat that became the story happened in Detroit. Navin Field, Ruth at the plate, Cobb in center field for the Tigers. Before the pitch, or between pitches, the specific timing has been told differently by different people. Cobb said something. From center field, loud enough that Ruth could hear it. What Cobb said has been described variously. The versions that have survived share certain elements. Cobb questioned whether what Ruth did was real baseball, questioned whether home runs required the intelligence and skill that the game was supposed to demand, said something that amounted to anyone strong enough could do what Ruth did, that Ruth's game was a lesser game, that the crowd cheering for home runs was a crowd that had been convinced that simplicity was spectacle, that Ruth was selling something and the sport was buying it, and the price was everything that made baseball worth playing. Subscribe if you've ever watched someone say something they couldn't take back. Hit like if you already know what Ruth did next, and drop a comment. Cobb or Ruth, whose baseball do you believe in? Because what happened on the next pitch ended the argument forever. Ruth heard it, turned and looked at Cobb in center field. This is the part that multiple witnesses described consistently. Ruth turned, looked directly at Cobb, did not respond verbally, did not gesture, did not show anything that could be read as anger or as acknowledgement that Cobb had said something worth acknowledging. He simply looked, for a moment, then turned back to the plate. The pitcher wound up, threw, and Ruth hit the baseball over the outfield fence in center field. Over Cobb's head, deep, gone. The kind of contact that ends conversations before the ball lands. Ruth ran the bases, at his pace. Crossing home plate, he did not look at center field, did not acknowledge Cobb, did not make any gesture that could be interpreted as a response to what had been said. The home run was the response. The home run was the complete and total and unambiguous response. No words needed, no words offered. Just the ball, just the trajectory, just the distance. Cobb retrieved the ball or watched it retrieved. The inning ended, the game continued. He did not say anything further about Ruth that day in a way that anyone recorded. What he said in later years, in the interviews he gave as an older man looking back at the players and the era, was more complicated than what he had said during their playing careers. He said Ruth had changed the game, said this as fact rather than complaint, which itself was a change from how he had always framed it. He said the game Ruth played was not the game Cobb had played, and this was true, and the game Ruth played had won. The crowds had chosen. The sport had chosen. The home run era had replaced the dead ball era, and there was no going back, and Cobb, who had spent a career fighting everything he couldn't control, had finally stopped fighting this particular thing. He said Ruth was the greatest player he had ever seen. Said it with the specific reluctance of a man who has reached a conclusion he did not want to reach but cannot argue with. Ruth never responded publicly to Cobb's change of position, never acknowledged the softening of the criticism. This was also like Ruth. He had made his argument, had made it in 1920 and 1921, and every season thereafter, had made it with the bat, with the numbers, with the crowds that came to watch him play. The argument was over, and Ruth knew it was over, and there was nothing more to say. Ty Cobb had represented a version of baseball that was genuinely excellent, had represented it at its absolute peak, had been the best that version could produce. And then Ruth had arrived and produced something different, and the game had never looked back. Two men, two baseballs, two answers to the same question. The game had chosen Ruth's answer, the crowds had chosen it, the numbers had chosen it. And Cobb, standing in center field in Detroit in 1921, had watched the ball clear the fence and understood, in the way that intelligent men understand things they don't want to understand, that the argument was already settled, that it had been settled before he opened his mouth, that Ruth's answer to whatever he said was already in the air before the pitch was thrown. Going, gone.